Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. Would ask our guests here in-house if you'll be so kind to check that those wonderful mobile devices have been silenced or turned off as a courtesy to our presenters. We, of course, welcome questions or comments from our internet viewers at any time, and you're welcome to email them to speaker@heritage.org. Following today's presentation, of course, we will post this program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference as well. It is our privilege this morning to welcome for our keynote Congressman Jim Bridenstine. The Congressman was elected in 2012 to represent Oklahoma's 1st Congressional District. He serves on the House Armed Services Committee as well as the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. He is chairman of the House Environment Subcommittee. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Bridenstine.
Thank you. Well, it's an honor to be here. A couple of weeks ago, we introduced the American Space Renaissance Act, and I know a lot of people here were there, and a lot of people here I have talked to about it apart from the symposium, the Space Symposium out in Colorado. I want to thank the Heritage Foundation for doing this. Thank you guys for your leadership on national security and defense issues. Eric Stallmer, I want to thank you. Where did Eric go? I lost him. There you are. I want to thank you for your leadership on these critically important issues and making sure those of us in Washington are informed and aware of the challenges that we face. And I also want to thank Dean Cheng, who has been a leader on these issues for a long time, not just specific to space, but also specific to China and the emerging threats therefrom, and how important your op-eds have been to our office as we read and learn more about some of the challenges that we face from China, especially in the space realm. So I want to be as brief as I can with my remarks, and then I want to open it up for questions, since a lot of you already know my philosophy. We introduced the American Space Renaissance Act, and I would encourage everybody to look at that bill, spacerenaissanceact.com. Is it .com or .org? .com, spacerenaissanceact.com. I would encourage everybody to visit the website. We've got a section by section, but beyond that, we have explainers for every section in the bill, and of course, some videos about why we're doing what we're doing in this bill. So spacerenaissanceact.com. Everybody is familiar with the mantra that space is becoming more congested, contested, and competitive. So I'm not going to use those words again in this speech. But suffice it to say that during the Cold War, space was a sanctuary characterized by a relatively benign operating environment dominated by two spacefaring nations, the United States of America and the Soviet Union. Now space is a warfighting domain, and paradoxically, America's greatest source of strategic advantage. But it's also true that if you listen to the Chinese, it is our Achilles heel. The old way of doing business is no longer viable. Legacy space architectures, constellations of integrated satellites, ground segments, and user terminals are too vulnerable in today's threat environment. They are stovepiped and they are costly. The next generation space architectures must be more resilient, more integrated, and more affordable. By the way, all of that is achievable in one fell swoop because of the technology advancements that have been happening, that are happening right now and have been happening for decades now. Above all, we need to move faster than our adversaries to deter conflict and to dissuade our adversaries from competing in this realm in the first place. And friends, that is possible as well. Rapid access is the key. Like I said, I introduced the American Space Renaissance Act a couple of weeks ago, specifically to help, not specifically, but one of the major provisions is to help facilitate rapid access. I'm going to go through a little case study here, Wideband Global Satcom, WGS, which most people in this room and probably people watching online are familiar with. DoD originally conceived WGS in the late 1990s as a gap filler capability to plug a bandwidth gap. WGS was conceived in the late 1990s. Its requirements were approved in the 2000s. The first WGS satellite was launched in 2007. WGS achieved global coverage in 2014, and the constellation will be complete in 2018. A decade between development and launch, 14 years to get global coverage, and 2 decades to get the full constellation on orbit. The total cost is in excess of $3.7 billion just for R&D and for procurement, not including the cost of operations and sustainment. This, friends, is the exact opposite of what we ought to be doing. Meanwhile, the warfighters' demand for SATCOM has grown exponentially, driven by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, of which I participated, and the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance requirements that we now see all over the world. Ultimately, the department began relying on commercial SATCOM to meet the demand, and we, the United States government and the Department of Defense, we have not looked back. We are still reliant on commercial SATCOM. Today, commercial provides about 80% of DoD's routine SATCOM, 80%. The quote-unquote temporary surge in SATCOM demand has become the new reality, and it is not going away. DoD could have chosen to double or triple the number of WGS communication satellites. We could have poured resources into producing them. Instead, DoD chose to get rapid access through leveraging the global capability already in space. This case study illustrates both why we need more rapid access to space and one way of achieving that objective. Friends, there are constellations already in space doing things that the U.S. government is building its own constellations to achieve. Why not take advantage of the commercial operations that are already there? So how do we achieve more rapid access to space? I think the answer fits into 3 buckets. Number 1, we need to leverage commercial systems that are already in space. Number 2, we need to maximize the capability of dedicated national security space assets. We have assets that are in space that probably are not fully utilized. In fact, for sure, they're not fully utilized. And we need to nurture the launch industrial base to provide more responsive launch options. Rapid access is not just about launch. It's about how do we gain access to capabilities as quickly as possible. Launch, of course, is an important element, but it's one of many elements. So we need to leverage existing commercial architectures. The fastest way to access space is to take advantage of capabilities already on orbit. SATCOM is a good example. As I mentioned, circumstances and the ISR revolution conspired to force the DoD to rely heavily on commercial SATCOM. Yet the department buys commercial SATCOM in the most inefficient way possible. Annual spot market leases using supplemental war funds, overseas contingency operations. Friends, those funds, that's 1-year money, which means if we're going to lease capacity from commercial for 1 year, that does not provide certainty or security for the people that we're leasing the bandwidth from. They would probably rather lease it to commercial for commercial purposes if they know they can get longer-term contracts or have more certainty into the future. DoD is missing a huge opportunity, namely that commercial owner-operators have global constellations in place which they are constantly refreshing. Our commercial operators are constantly refreshing their constellations with higher throughput capabilities and better protected systems. Rapid access to space means that future architectures must deliberately plan to incorporate commercial upfront. If we're trying to have commercial operators do things like protected communications, for example, frequency hopping for anti-jam capabilities, or if we're looking for commercial operators to provide encryption, well, then they need to be involved in the process upfront, rather than just the government coming to them after their constellations are already on orbit and saying, hey, we need some capacity, which, by the way, then we can get the capacity, but it might not have the protections that the warfighter needs. So we have to include commercial up front. The American Space Renaissance Act requires DoD to fully consider commercial SATCOM capabilities, technology insertion plans, and service models in the WGS follow-on analysis of alternatives. I believe the WGS follow-on architecture should include a mix of dedicated government and commercial capabilities. The important part is that DoD leverage commercial to fulfill specific requirements. Predictability and long-term commitment gives the industry the necessary incentives to add protection, performance, and other capabilities during development prior to launch so that the warfighter is getting the same high-quality SATCOM no matter the source. Substantial gains are possible to the extent that DoD buys data and services rather than procure, own, and operate and sustain its own space systems. We just went through the example of SATCOM. And I think that's a very good example. How do we get rapid capabilities in space? Well, we'll lease from commercial operators that are already there. There are two other areas where not only the DoD but also NOAA are moving forward. One is imagery, remote sensing. So when you think about the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency, they just put out a commercial space policy. And what they're trying to encourage and incentivize American companies to do is develop constellations in low Earth orbit that can do remote sensing and imagery, and then the DoD would buy data. The question is, why would these companies do this? Would it be because the DoD is their customer? Well, possibly. But more likely, the DoD is one of many customers. And that's the idea here. When you do Google Maps, or when you're looking at a chart and trying to figure out where is the best place to buy a home, what is the best school system, these are all commercial capabilities, the imagery, commercial capabilities that have been launched not because the DoD is a customer, but they've been launched because there is a profit motive for commercial operators to do this. So that being the case, DoD ought to buy that data from commercial operators that are already doing this kind of activity. And by the way, that will stimulate even more activity. One of the challenges we have is that when a commercial operator for imagery wants to get a license to do this kind of activity, that license can be revoked or it can be put on hold. And when that happens, all of a sudden, you lose massive amounts of investment that are going into this industry. And that puts us at risk. So what we have to do is make sure that if you get a license from NOAA, NOAA is the agency that, it's the Department of Commerce, but NOAA is the agency that does it. If you get a license to do remote sensing and imagery from space, and the government revokes that license for whatever reason, friends, you should be compensated. And the reason you should be compensated is not just because this one company could collapse, but because the entire industry is looking at this model and they're saying, look, we don't want to capitalize our own constellation of remote sensing satellites if we're going to get our license revoked. So this is a challenge that we have to overcome. Commercial gives us, when it comes to remote sensing and imagery, it gives us more rapid revisit times. It gives us the ability, the word dwell probably is not the right word, but when you have more rapid revisit times, you are in essence providing a better dwell capability. And that's what we're trying to do here. Companies like Digital Globe, Terabella, used to be Skybox, Black Sky. These are companies that are doing this kind of activity, not because the government is a customer, but because there are commercial customers, and the government could be but one. And that will, by the way, that distributes the architecture for commercial imagery. In other words, instead of having a huge monolithic intelligence community government-owned and operated satellite that could be a target by the Chinese, and everybody in this room is aware that the Chinese have tested direct descent anti-satellite missiles that shot down one of their own satellites, a weather satellite, back in 2007, and now they're testing these direct descent anti-satellite missiles all the way up to geostationary orbit, which is 33,000 kilometers from Earth, which we didn't anticipate would be contested this soon, but it is. So if they're going to shoot down satellites, what's the quickest way we can mitigate that threat? We need to distribute the architecture. If there are hundreds of satellites providing these kind of capabilities for commercial purposes, and the DoD is one customer, what are they going to do? Shoot down all 100? Maybe there's 200, 300, 400 satellites. Are they going to shoot down all 400? And by doing that, they would be denying space to the world at large, which is unsatisfactory, and they would receive a ton of pushback from the entire world if they ever tried to deny space for everybody in the world. So distributing this architecture by taking advantage of commercial is, I think, an important part of the strategy that the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency has already seen and they're moving forward on. Another area is weather. There are people out there that are launching constellations into space doing technologies like GPS radio occultation and hyperspectral sensing, and they're doing it not because, again, the government is a customer. They're doing it because they're serving other customers. If you are in the transportation industry and you can get an advantage from having better weather data, better able to predict weather, whether you're a shipping company on the ocean or a trucking company, people are wanting that advantage. Oil companies. I was down at Shell not too long ago, and I saw they have their own weather department in Shell. So energy companies, transportation companies, agricultural companies, insurance companies, reinsurance companies, they're all trying to gain an advantage on each other by having better weather capabilities. So they're buying data. They will be buying data from commercial space-based assets that are providing this kind of data. And they'll be feeding numerical weather models that either they themselves develop or they take advantage from universities that have developed that kind of activity. So if there are commercial operators out there providing GPS radio occultation and hyperspectral sensing, the government ought to be one of many customers. Right now we have problems. I chair the subcommittee on the environment within the science committee. And when you look at our JPSS satellites or our GOES satellites, those are our weather satellites, both programs are behind schedule and way over cost, significantly. The Suomi NPP satellite, which was the predecessor to JPSS, is at the end of its useful life. And JPSS is not planned to be launched until 2017, if you believe that, which it's been delayed before and again. So here's the reality, and I am not suggesting, I'm from Oklahoma, okay? We had people die just yesterday in tornadoes in Oklahoma, and it will happen again next year. It happens every year. I do not want to cannibalize the JPSS program, nor do I want to cannibalize the GOES program. But what we can do is have a robust commercial environment where we can augment the numerical weather models that with data from commercial industry. And the reason we need to do that is because it is a mitigation of a risk. Not because we're trying to replace the government backbone, not because we're trying to eliminate it, but because it is a mitigation of risk. The government would be one of many customers. Also, that would distribute the architecture, because now commercial operators would have dozens, if not hundreds, of satellites providing weather data to our numerical weather models. Remember, the Chinese shot down a weather satellite, one of their own, back in 2007. And in 2014, they hacked into the National Weather Service of the United States, compelled us to shut down ground stations, and we lost weather data for a period of 3 days. By the way, thank God that we didn't have severe weather activity in the United States during those 3 days. My constituents would have been the recipients of a lot of pain had that happened. Here's what we know, and of course Dean Cheng is the author of great pieces that talk about this. The way you fight and win wars in the future, in fact, it's not just the future, it's the way wars have always been fought and won. Information dominance. The enemies of the United States know that information dominance is how you win wars. And if they can deny us the information and they can have the information, then they're going to have the advantage. And that's true whether you're talking about remote sensing and imagery, whether you're talking about weather. As an aircraft carrier pilot, I've got 333 carrier arrested landings. You got to know what the weather's going to be when you're going to come down on an aircraft carrier. And that includes winds. You know how hard it is to predict winds over the ocean? It's pretty difficult. And when you're landing on an aircraft carrier, you need that information. That's why these kind of activities are important. If they can deny us the ability to predict weather over the ocean, we're in trouble. And they know it, which is why they've called space our Achilles heel. And weather is one of many issues. We also need to maximize on-orbit national security space assets. One area that I've talked about is CHIRP, which is a commercially hosted infrared payload. I'd say it's a commercially hosted infrared government payload. It's an infrared payload that is designed to predict or sense rocket launches, early warning for rocket launches. And of course, those rocket launches could be any kind of rocket. But what we're learning now is that SBIRS has other capabilities that are not just for detecting rocket launches. We have the opportunity in some cases to use that data for weather prediction, fire prediction. When you think about all the fires in California and other places, we can use that technology for that. We need to be able to maximize your taxpayer dollars that have been invested in these systems Yes, it's true these are national security systems, but they can be used for other purposes that are not specific to national security. We also need to nurture the launch industrial base. This was the third item I talked about. I think that when you think about launch in this country, there is a lot of talk about the RD-180 engine and how we're dependent on Russia for our Atlas V rockets that use the RD-180 engine. And we just went through the National Defense Authorization Act. We authorized more RD-180 engines, and that makes everybody uncomfortable, me uncomfortable. But the bottom line is this: we need assured access to space. And we are where we are, and we have to assess where we currently are and make good decisions going forward. We need to get off RD-180 engines. Everybody agrees with that. It's a high-profile issue here on Capitol Hill. But I will also tell you it is one of many areas, one of many, where we are dependent on the Russians. When you think about our commercial satellites being launched on Russian Dnipro rockets or Russian Soyuz rockets, or our astronauts being launched on Russian Soyuz rockets, you think about the Proton rocket, which is used for commercial resupply to the International Space Station. The head of Roscosmos the other day in an article, Aviation Week and Space Technology article, here's what he said. He said they are doing off-balance sheet financing for their space systems. We're talking about their space-based communication architecture and their remote sensing and imagery architecture. They're doing off-balance sheet financing. In other words, and this is what the article said, they are launching foreign astronauts and foreign satellites and using that money to develop their own architectures for national security. So every time you see an American astronaut launch on a Soyuz, we're funding Russia's national security space assets. Every time you see a Proton launched to the International Space Station for resupply, you're seeing American dollars funding national security space assets for Russia. These are very real situations, and this, of course, is much bigger than the RD-180 engine alone. This is a challenge that we have to face. We need a domestic launch capability that is second to none, and that includes a venture class launch service program. You saw what NASA did. They created a venture class launch service program, and they hired 3 companies that would advance smaller rockets to launch smaller payloads into specific orbits in low Earth orbit, and they issued, I think it was $17 million in contracts, which is not, I'll tell you, in this town, that's like budget dust, right? I'm not saying it's right that that's budget dust, but that's kind of what it is. But here's the reality. That means that we're not going to be dependent on using Russian Dnipro rockets. We're not going to be dependent on using Russian Proton rockets. We're not going to be funding the Russian military industrial complex so they can develop assets that are going to be hostile to us or could potentially be hostile to us. So these are very real situations that we need to deal with. The RD-180 issue is important, but it is, quite frankly, just the tip of the iceberg when you look at the entire complex. We have American companies that are also dependent on the RD-181. So these are very real situations. We've got OneWeb, which is going to launch a constellation of 700, 900 satellites. Every time I read, it's a new number. But we're talking about hundreds of satellites, and they entered into a contract to buy $1.5 billion worth of Russian Soyuz launches. And why are they doing that? Because they have to have the capacity. The United States is not able to provide that for them. So this is a very real challenge. And it's not just them, it's a whole host of others that are dependent on Russia for the same things. So we've got to make sure that our industrial base is there, that we have a domestic capability for launch. And this is, I'm going to conclude with this. We're getting close. I need to have some time for questions. We need to better leverage commercial systems that are already in space. We talked about communications. We talked about weather. We talked about remote sensing and imagery. We need to maximize our existing national security space assets so that they can be used not only for national security, but also other situations that are not necessarily national security. And we have to support an industrial base that is domestic so that we're not dependent on the Russians, and we can have responsive options to populate and constitute constellations. Ultimately, achieving more rapid access to space requires a paradigm shift. Space is no longer a sanctuary. Our current systems are too vulnerable, stovepiped, and expensive. Our next generation of national security space systems must be resilient, integrated, and affordable, and we can achieve that through some of the areas that I just talked about today. All right, I'm going to open it up for questions. And yes, sir.
Thank you, Congressman.
Oh,
Thank you, Congressman. You talked.
can you tell us who you are?
Charles Miller with Next Gen Space.
Okay, got it.
So you talked at length about our vulnerability to asymmetric attacks by our opponents in the world.
Yes.
And this was studied extensively. In fact, there was a bipartisan national commission in 2000 who pointed out we're exposed to a Pearl Harbor attack in space.
The Rumsfeld Commission,
The
yeah.
Rumsfeld Commission, which when he became Secretary of Defense, it was a bipartisan commission started by the Clinton administration, but nothing happened.
Right.
Okay, now we're here where we are. We've seen what China's done, which you talked about. Some people have proposed that what we really should doing and leapfrogging them and leveraging these commercial assets is instead of having launches in months or years, we should develop the capability with reusable launch vehicles
Yes.
to launch in days or maybe a week. And so what do you think about that? Because you could surge launch, you could take away, even if they knocked out those 300 or 400 assets, we
Right.
could pop up a whole bunch more.
No, you're
and
right.
take away that whole vulnerability. What do you think of that development?
You know, rapid reconstitution is absolutely critical. I agree with you 100%. And you're right. That report came out, was it 2000, 2001? And yet we are still in the same place now that we were there. We've done some things, don't get me wrong. But the idea that we could face a space Pearl Harbor is still very real. And if you look at what the enemies of the United States are saying publicly, they are seeing us as having an Achilles heel in space. So rapid reconstitution is critically important. But here, even before we get to that point where we have this Pearl Harbor and we've got to rapidly launch things, we have to do things that will dissuade them from making those investments to begin with. How do we do that? Well, when we distribute the architecture, when we disaggregate our capabilities, and we have satellites that are the size, and we're not there yet, but in some cases we are. We have satellites that look like this, and there are thousands and thousands of them. Well, then what are they going to do? How do they deny us the ability? They're not going to be able to launch $1 billion rocket to shoot down one of thousands of satellites, and it won't make one iota bit of difference in the war at large. So if they know it won't have an impact on the war that's happening on the ground, they're not going to make the billions of dollars worth of investments to do that. So distribution and disaggregation, I think, is a key component of preventing that space Pearl Harbor that the commission talked about. I would also argue reusability is critically important. That's being driven right now, not by government. That's being driven by free market, free enterprise, where people are trying to figure out how do we reduce the cost of launch. So you've got SpaceX and ULA both competing now on reusability, and ULA isn't quite where SpaceX is. And you've got Blue Origin doing the same thing, although they're not doing orbital flights with that kind of reusability yet. But they will. So you're hitting the nail on the head. When you talk about bringing down the cost of launch, you talk about increasing access. There's two elements. One, make it such that if they want to do a space Pearl Harbor, it will be absolutely ineffective. And number two, make sure that that should they do it anyway, that we can rapidly reconstitute. The goal here is to deter them from doing it to begin with. And that means space protection is, something that is talked about on the Hill now. We have to be able and willing to protect our assets. And that doesn't mean we're weaponizing space. That means we're protecting space, not only for us, but for civil society at large. You think about space, and I know I'm getting the hook here. You think about space. That's my hook. You think about space. The way we navigate, the way we communicate, the way we produce food and energy, the way we do banking. Imagine in this country if we lost the GPS constellation. Banking shuts down. How many days will we have food in the grocery store when banking shuts down? How many days will we have be able to fill our car up with gasoline when banking shuts down? Every time you use the gas pump, that is an electronic fund transfer that is using the GPS constellation. So our very way of life, and the American public at large is not aware of this. But it's one of the reasons I did the American Space Renaissance Act. It's one of the reasons I'm here today, and this is going to be online. The American public needs to be aware that our very way of life is now dependent on space. And to the extent that there is a space Pearl Harbor, our way of life shuts down. The enemies of the United States not only recognize it, they talk about it publicly. So we need to be aware of it. Space protection is critical, and it shouldn't be demonized as weaponizing. We don't want to weaponize space. We want to protect assets that are already there, that are necessary for our very way of life, and all of the advancements that have been born by access to space. And of course, lower cost, which is what you're talking about, reusability, lower cost, the miniaturization of electronics, all of these things are going to continue to advance, and because of that, we will become even more dependent as time goes on space. So this is a lot like the airspace was in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. It's going to change, and it has changed and will continue to change the way we live and make our lives better. So with that, I just want to thank you all for having me. Again, SpaceRenaissanceAct.com. Visit the website, SpaceRenaissanceAct.com. I've got to get back to the Hill and do Hill stuff. But it's always an honor to be here, and I appreciate you guys so much. Thank you. Thank you.
And if our panelists want to take their places on stage, we'll continue with the program. I love that excellent description of what goes on Capitol Hill. It follows when we had Bring Our Kids to Work today here, when we asked one of the students, I think he was 4, what does your dad do at Heritage? And his answer was, stuff. So the congressman's gone back to Hill stuff. As we continue our program, J.V. Venable will be leading our panel discussion. J.V. is Senior Research Fellow for Defense Policy here in our Center for National Defense. He is a 25-year veteran of the U.S. Air Force, served in 3 combat operations, and also served in 16 locations around the world as both an air controller, fighter pilot, and staff officer. I'm very impressed to note that he was a former commander of the Air Force Aerial Demonstration Squadron, the Thunderbirds. In his last active duty assignment, he served as a principal advisor to the Air Force's Chief of Staff and Director of Operations in their roles on the President's Joint Chiefs of Staff. His research here at Heritage focuses on plans, programs, and operational capabilities of the Defense Department, and of course, particular to today's event, those that affect air and space matters. Please join me in welcoming J.V. Venable. J.V.?
Thank you, John. Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. What a fabulous introduction to the conversation. This congressman is special, and Congressman Bridenstine has really kicked us off in fine regard. We've got 3 extraordinary panelists who are going to heat up that discussion, and I'd like to introduce each of the 3. Eric Stallmer is the president of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation, an organization dedicated to promoting the development of commercial spaceflight. Under Stallmer's leadership, CSF has worked tirelessly to develop industry standards, craft the modern Commercial Space Launch Act, and encourage further growth in the commercial spaceflight industry. Mr. Stallmer served as the Vice President of Government Relations at Analytical Graphics Incorporated and with the Space Transportation Association. He's served on Capitol Hill in the office of Congressman Tom Coburn, and you may not know this, but he has served as an active duty Army officer and continues to serve still as a member of the Army Reserves. He is currently assigned to the Pentagon in the office of the Army G4, which is the Deputy Chief of Staff for Army Logistics. Mr. Stallmer earned a Master's of Arts degree in Public Administration from George Mason University and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science and History from Mount St. Mary College in Newburgh, New York. Earlier this year, he testified before the Senate Subcommittee on Science, Space, and Competitiveness, where he urged Congress to codify productive policies to facilitate growth and innovation in the industry and maintain American leadership in the space sector's competitive environment. Eric, thank you for joining us today. Dr. Everett Dolman is the next gentleman in the line. He is a professor of comparative military studies at the U.S. Air Force's School of Advanced Air and Space Studies, also known as SAS. His focus is on international relations and theory, and he has been identified as the Air University's first space theorist, which is a great title indeed. Dr. Dolman began his career as an intelligence analyst for the National Security Agency and moved to the United States Space Command in 1986. In 1991, he received the Outstanding Intelligence Analyst Award from the Director of Central Intelligence. Dr. Dolman received his PhD in political science from the University of Pennsylvania in 1995. He went on to teach international relations and international political economy at the University of William and Mary, the Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, and Berry College before taking his current position at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. Dr. Dolman is also the co-founder and managing editor of Astropolitics, the International Journal of Space Power and Policy. But what is of extraordinary note to me is he's published works to include Astropolitik, Classic Geopolitics in the Space Age, and he published that in 2002. He has a forthcoming book titled Pure Strategy, Power and Principle in Space and the Information Age. He's written for the Journal of Strategic Studies, Comparative Strategy, Journal of Small Wars and Insurgencies, Soviet and Post-Soviet Review Citizenship Studies, Politics and Society, and the Journal of Political and Military Sociology. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Dolman. Dean Chang is one of our own. Mr. Dean Chang brings detailed knowledge of China's military and space capabilities to bear as the Heritage Foundation's Research Fellow on Chinese political and security affairs. Prior to joining Heritage, he worked as a senior analyst with Science Applications International Corporation, you know that as SAIC, and then went with the China Studies Division of the Center for Naval Analysis. Before entering the private sector, Dean studied China's defense industry complex for the Office of Technology and Assessment as an analyst in the International Security and Space Program. Mr. Chang earned a bachelor's degree in politics from Princeton University in 1986 and studied for a doctorate at MIT. He has appeared on public affairs shows such as John McLaughlin's One-on-One and programs like broad brush-up programs at the NPR, CNN International, BBC World Service, and International Television News. He has been interviewed by or provided commentary for publications such as Time Magazine, The Washington Post, Financial Times, Bloomberg News, Jane's Defense Weekly, and for major media outlets in both South Korea and Hong Kong. Mr. Chang has spoken at the National Space Symposium, National Defense University, the Air Force Academy, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Eisenhower Center for Space and Defense Studies. Ladies and gentlemen, this is quite a group of folks. I would like if you would be so kind as to welcome these folks to the stage. With the remarks that we got up front, we have three topic areas that go in line with several different lines of thought. Leveraging commercial capabilities, maximizing national security assets, and to nurture the industrial base for the space launch industry here in the United States. With that, I will open it up to remarks, and Eric, if you don't mind starting us off.
Okay, I'll just start with some quick remarks. It's always, depressing following Congressman Bridenstine because he manages to touch on just about every issue that we're dealing with in such a eloquent and succinct manner. But he really did touch on a lot of the key issues that are critical to the space industry today and the national security implications that we're facing. Some of the issues that we're dealing with, and what we certainly want to applaud what the Congressman did with last year's Congress passing the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act. It really paved the way for the commercial space industry, and not just in what we're aspiring to do in the near future, but what we're doing today and working not just with industry, but also with our government partners. And it's really critical, especially as we're talking about the rapid access to space and space on demand and all of the heavy requirements that the Air Force is looking at today. They're not going to achieve it without their commercial partners. I can guarantee you that. And there's challenges. There's certainly a lot of challenges out there the interaction with the government, with the commercial industry. There's great interactions and there's great cooperation, but I think we can do so much more. And the process and how the process and procedures that we follow needs to be enhanced. And also to showcase, the commercial industry has to really showcase to the government what their capabilities are in order to help them, knowing how they can help themselves sometimes. So I'm definitely inspired by that, and inspired by the work that a lot of our commercial companies are doing, and I'll go into a little more depth on about a lot of our launch companies, not to mention our satellite companies and the innovation that's there. And I also hit on some of the areas of great concern to us on this innovation and investment. You can't develop an industry without those two factors. So you need private sector investment and you need innovation. And there's at times, certainly right now, there's concern with some of the policies that Congress is looking at, and that the Department of Defense is dealing with on mainly access to space. The utilization of excess ICBMs, for one, definitely comes to mind, and the impact that could have on the commercial industry. I think it could be huge, and I think it's a policy that's been in place for a long time. And to quickly change that policy, I think we really need to take a step back and really examine what kind of implications and that would have on not just the launch providers. It certainly could have on that, but the forecast of the industry as a whole. But if we jeopardize the innovation and the investment that took place with these launch providers, I think we could really take a step backwards. The Congressman has mentioned the Space Renaissance Act, and I really believe that we are truly in a renaissance period of the commercial space industry as a whole. And I think, not to be big cliche here, but I don't want to go into the dark ages, if we take a step backwards. And I think, changing some of these policies that have been working for the industry could really do that and impact that. So I know we're tight on time, and there's definitely two smarter guys next to me that have more insight. So I want to pass it over to Dr. Dolman.
Well, thank you very much. We're very happy to be here representing Air University. In the 1930s, airplanes had already proven their value and their worth to both military and commercial activities. They'd made their debut. They were supporting a lot of new innovative ideas, but they were hardly mature. And in the 1930s at Maxwell Field, the Army Air Corps Tactical Air School began looking at ideas, what could be done in what would be coming wars or in preventing coming wars with this aviation capability called air power. And they developed all of the basic plans and tactics that the United States would eventually use in World War II. But that wasn't just the only point, was to look at how to use space power today to make a comparison effectively. It was, where could we get advantages in air power as the United States, as a great commercial entity, a great capitalist nation, and a free market nation. And so General Hap Arnold began doing some things that were a little unconventional at that time. He began going to commercial entities and asking them where they were going, what they needed from the Army Air Corps that might help them develop new capabilities. So we look at this and partnering even with entities such as movie makers and others to create an understanding among the public of how important and valuable this was. We look at our role today at Maxwell Air Force Base and Air University as similar. Where are we going in the future with space power? What can the DoD do to give advantages to space power, where we have to be worried about security implications, and of course, what we can do in the future given these capabilities that will give us an advantage on the battle space. We see not only rapid relaunch capability, but ultra-low cost to orbit capability as the linchpin of a neo-industrial age and a new era of completely green industry and applications. And we have dozens of good ideas. And we want to know now, because we understand in the short term, in a crisis, government direct funding of specific things can bring about that specific item or capability very quickly. But in the long term, innovation and practice is what gives America the absolute advantage it has on staying at the technological forefront of development. So we are looking to see how the government and the DoD in particular can partner with commercial organizations, see where they're going, and try to, as my boss says, fail early and fail often. find out where the new ideas are coming from, where the best ones are coming from, and support those ideas and support that development, and then pick up on those applications. Low cost, vastly lower cost entry to space, which will give us the rapid capability to space. Eventually, what we hope to see is space access, space transportation being as reliable and routine as commercial air traffic is today. And what role will the DoD play in that? There's going to be security challenges. We've talked about having access to space from thousands and thousands of satellites. We're looking now not at specific platforms, but at capabilities, and large networks of satellites capable of doing a lot of things. And satellites today are getting very, very expensive in the micro realm. Where will that lead when we can see into every place? If Google is successful in getting its 4,000 satellites online, what we see is Google Earth today, where you can get a picture of your house or something every couple times every year, to a point where we can get near real-time access to anything that's going on anywhere in the world, and anyone can see it, possibly for free. We might even have the capability of streaming access of your own home at any point. You can see who's pulling into your driveway. What does that do for United States security? Is that a concern? It will certainly be a concern to countries that don't like access or don't like that kind of transparency. What happens when rocket costs become so low and commercially available that you can simply buy a rocket with a medium capability, launch it from an international platform, perhaps out at sea, and put anything you want on it, because a space launch vehicle has many of the characteristics of an intercontinental ballistic missile. We do have security concerns. We're worried about that. But we do believe that if the United States is the forefront of commercial development, we can actually take advantage of creating a competitive neo-industrial age with such things as power generation from space, et cetera, that can have benefit for all humanity. And there are models. GPS was mentioned by the congressman as having tremendous impact on our commerce today. Just-in-time supply, internet, secure internet communications, all based on GPS. But it's difficult to remember that in the 1980s, when GPS was proposed as a capability for the military, there was no commercial model. There was no business model that could say this would get a profit. No one wanted to put it up. The government had to put it up. And once it was up and made available to the world, the ingenious developers of business have put billions and billions of economic development in ideas that we never thought possible, such that many countries today are making sure that if we don't have GPS up, they'll get some system capability of that. We are looking at space, in this case, as infrastructure. And if I can have one last comment, if we can get rapid access to space, we will have ideas and capabilities and new commerce and new industry that appears out of, that no one is thinking of today. Like the automobile when it was developed and the Model T comes along and suddenly automobiles are everywhere, we began to look at what the government does for infrastructure. I think we need to think of space capabilities like GPS, like weather monitoring, like communications, as basic infrastructure. And this is going to support that. The United States DoD will have a role in that, in monitoring, assisting in regulating, and in enforcing international rules and norms in this new area of transit. Thank you.
Well, good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. My name is Dean Chang. I'm going to be speaking on a somewhat different topic than my colleagues here. I'm going to try and address briefly how the Chinese view space and why the Chinese focus on space makes operationally responsive space an important factor for us. The first thing to keep in mind, and Representative Bridenstine touched on this, is in fact how much China now focuses on the ability to establish information dominance. The Chinese do in fact talk about the idea that future wars will be local wars under informationized conditions, that the key to winning such future wars is the ability to establish information dominance, and the extent to which space is a key part of that ability to establish information dominance. We see this in Chinese official documents and policy statements. The National Defense Law of 2015 specifically included clauses on the importance for China of establishing space and network security. The PRC Defense White Paper that came out in 2015 discussed space and cyber. And I bring up space and cyber because, again, for the Chinese, these are very much integrally linked because it's actually all about information. The science of military strategy. Those of you who truly need nighttime reading, I highly recommend this volume, but is a Chinese military textbook that includes chapters, again, discussing space and other new domains. Chinese doctrine talks about active defense, all aspects, unified, key point is space dominance. That's sort of their broad doctrinal takeaway in thinking about space. The need to seize the initiative in space as part of the active defense. The idea that space doesn't occur in a vacuum, sorry, bad pun, but that it is instead needs to be thought about as it links to terrestrial operations, air, land, and sea operations, that the idea of a space campaign by itself, a nice bloodless conflict, since space satellites have no parents, that is not how the Chinese think about it. Chinese think about establishing space dominance as part of the effort to achieve strategic conditions that will further terrestrial political objectives. War is still a political issue here on Earth, and space is part of that terrestrial battlefield. And finally, the importance of linking, therefore, not just hard kill, not just the cool image of satellites being shot down through kinetic kill vehicles and things, but hard kill and soft kill. And for the Chinese, going after the terrestrial elements, space launch facilities, mission control centers, tracking, telemetry, and control sites as part of the effort to establish space dominance. What we see with the latest Chinese military reorganization heightens, or should heighten, our concern about this. The Chinese military reorganization of 2015-2016 is proceeding in 3 phases. Any single one of these is tectonic by itself. All 3 together is truly earth-shaking. The Chinese Central Military Commission is being reorganized, and what used to be the General Staff Department is now called the Joint Staff Department to highlight the importance of joint operations. Why does joint operations influence space? Because the ability to create a common situational picture relies upon the smooth flow of information, which in turn the Chinese note is tied to access to space and space data. The creation of new war zone commands to replace the old military regions. Xi Jinping was recently videotaped at a Chinese command center. That is one of the new permanent joint command centers. And these permanent joint command centers will have a space planning cell. And finally, the creation of 3 new services, Ground Force Service, the PLA Rocket Forces, and most importantly here, the PLA Strategic Support Force. This Strategic Support Force might have been better labeled the PLA Information Warfare Force, because this new service includes space, electronic warfare, and network warfare. The Russians have created a dedicated aerospace force. The Chinese are going down a different path. They are saying space is important as part of this information campaign, the information war. And therefore, we will create a single service that ties together network warfare, electronic warfare, and space warfare. All of this ties to the broader set of development trends the Chinese have been talking about, their own interest in rapid space launch, their own interest in expanding offensive and defensive capabilities, their own interest in small satellites, and their own emphasis on even private, or in China more accurately, commercial space services. It should be noteworthy that the Chang'e 4, the Chinese lunar shot that will go to the far side of the moon, at the bottom of this announcement was that it would be open to investment by Chinese commercial investors. Because, as Dr. Stallmer noted, commercial sector still has the lead in innovation. The Chinese understand that. They want to tap into that. They want to have all of these Chinese companies, people like Jack Ma and Alibaba, saying, like Jeff Bezos, like Elon Musk, you've got lots of money. This is an opportunity for you to get in on the ground floor, the first stage, if you will, of space development. While meanwhile, the Chinese government also continues to pursue a range of small satellites, including the Huanjing Environmental satellite, China's first synthetic aperture radars are going up on that, small sats, and their own mobile boosters, including the Kuaizhou solid rocket booster. And we think that the Chinese may deploy a number of these around China, complete with payload already mated, ready to launch, basically, if necessary, to replace or supplement Chinese constellations in time of crisis and conflict. Thank you very much.
Well, fabulous. Opening volleys out. We've got a whole lot of things to discuss. We'll open it up for questions in just a minute or two, but just to spur on a couple of thoughts that each of you kind of had, it's the combination of government and the commercial sector. Innovation is got to be the key to each one of the areas. So with that as kind of the launching point, what actions does industry need to take, and the federal government need to do to not just to compete, but to get us back on the leading edge of this commercial sector and put us on the leading edge of rapid access to space? Eric, any thoughts?
The challenge that I've seen over the years is as industry is innovating, and they're trying to give this message of what they're doing to the private sector, there's often at times a resistance from, and this case we're talking, mostly the Air Force, this resistance of not invented here, we have this capability, the questioning of the cost, and just also the comfort of the systems that they have. I've often joked that the Air Force will always do the right thing after they've tried everything else. And in some instances, it truly is accurate. In the situation with the JSPOC, the Joint Space Operations Center, the resistance that there was of integrating commercial technology that was head and shoulders, decades above the quality that they were using on the outdated SPADOC system. And the challenges that it was to integrate the commercial technology into the center, and it's still dragging on. Instead of this warm embrace, it's often the cold shoulder. That has to change, and I see that, and that's a last year's problem, and the current problems is going to be with the launch side of the house. As these new small launch companies are coming online, the Air Force has really got to look to these as partners, and how they can, with the rapid access to space, how can they utilize the technology that we have out there that is being developed by by private investment, that the innovation is today's innovation. It's not 20, 40-year-old innovation. And how can they better partner with industry? And I think that's a critical step forward to the Air Force. I think the young Air Force gets it. The young officers that grew up with this new technology are understanding it, where I think it's the senior leadership really has to embrace it more and try to understand it and not fight it, and more of a partnership, I think.
Excellent. Dr. Dolman?
Well, we have to change our thinking in a lot of ways. In the space realm, for example, we would put up large, very, very capable, scientifically cutting-edge satellites. Of course, we developed them with a 6-year lifetime into production, making the cutting edge something that's not quite there. In the 1990s, we were launching large communication satellites, for example, with a planned 20-year lifetime, and very proud that we could extend those to 30 years, and sometimes that means a satellite launched in 1995 with a Pentium 286 chip is still the cutting edge that we're looking at. What is our solution? 5 years ago, we decided we'll put up a satellite with a 30-year lifetime, the same type of satellite. Today, we are looking at ideas from business where you can put up a network of 100 or 200 small microsatellites, essentially an iPhone 6 with solar panels, $25,000 to $50,000 at the most per satellite. You don't need a clean room to make them, and you can launch them all on one booster into a network. It might have a year or a year and a half lifetime, and so that by the time you've got it up in space, you're already preparing the next generation of chip that goes on to that, the next generation of capability. This is not something that the government is able to do very quickly. We need to speed up the ability to get contracts out and to look for capabilities rather than platforms we're going to look at. Secondly, I think legally there are some real big issues. The international regime for outer space was debated and negotiated in the early 1960s and signed into the law in the mid-1960s. This is a Cold War era regime that was negotiated between two states that were in the midst of a massive nuclear and conventional arms buildup In addition, the United States was fighting the Vietnam War at its height, and we were attempting to initiate Johnson's Great Society program. We simply did not have the resources to go into a space race other than to the moon, a military space race, in this case, with the Soviet Union. And so we came up with the compromise of a space regime that essentially gave in to the socialist demands that capitalism, commercialism, free enterprise would not go into space, because that was clearly in the United States' advantage. And in response for that, we also gave a denouement on military access into space and such things. I believe that we can go into space, but it may be that we have to renegotiate a new regime. Now, the congressman today, his efforts are a beginning at that, chipping away at that to allow commercial access to go into space. But currently, it is in limbo whether the fruits of access to space can actually belong to those who take them. There are numerous proposals on how to give incentives to go into space, that you can go out, do asteroid mining, put stuff up in space that might have applications we don't think about that would allow you to make a profit from what you do, and yet still provide benefits for all of humanity. If we can come up with those kinds of incentives, I think that's good. Whether we chip away at the current regime to make it more competitive in the commercial sense, to make it more capitalist and free market, or whether we get a new regime negotiated is between the governments. But we're going to need some work on the legal side of it as well.
Dean, any thoughts?
Two broad aspects, both of which are not space-specific. The first is the fundamental problem of our own budgeting process. I don't think anyone can look at sequestration and be proud of how we got there. But the reality is that sequestration and similar lumpy, bumpy budgets where we appropriate X amount of money for programs that, say, take 6 years to develop a satellite, and then on year 3 say, oh, you know what, we're going to try and balance the budget this year, so I'm going to zero out the item or slash it by 60%, but we'll extend production instead. One of the great strengths of the Chinese is long-term thinking, which is, I think, frankly, overblown. But one of the things that they do have is budgetary stability. We're going to do X. We're going to allocate money to do X. This is something that is really important to the Chinese leadership. Space is a prominent example of this. And then they allocate the money and it proceeds forward. So when you have programmatic instability as we do, then you wind up with the need for each satellite, because we may only buy one, to then be all things to all people, last forever, and oh, by the way, it has to be cutting edge, which in 1995 was a 286 chip. And that meant you also had moderate levels of technological risk as a result, because you're using cutting edge. And that goes to the other aspect, which is the federal acquisition regulations and defense federal acquisition regulations, because I'm not sure that innovation has ever been promoted through a 1,000-page acquisition process. Just think about this. Go back to, say, 1985, pre-computers, and look at the number of committees that could hold hearings about the military. Not just space, the military entirely. House and Senate Appropriations, House and Senate Armed Services, maybe one or two other subcommittees. Even then, you're talking about maybe 6 feet of hearings a year. Now think about today's Congress. How many committees have a piece of the defense budget? Labor, environment, commercial use, small business administration. How many feet of hearings is that? Now try and imagine how you, as an innovator, are going to wander through that thicket and produce innovation and then come back and say, oh, but we'll be able to do. I really hope I am wrong and you folks are right, that we'll have hundreds and thousands of small satellites, and they'll be going up like, the 807 from Greenwich. But I fear that we are our own worst enemy. Pogo was right, and in this case, that it's the regulations that will just snuff this in the cradle.
Yeah, so we're talking right now about really innovation and letting innovation go, right? So the government's fear is that you're going to let the dogs will be out and you can't get them. They'll be gnawing on the neighbor's legs. You got to bring them back. And the industry is caged up wanting to go free. what concessions, a bit of a different cant, what concessions does industry need to be willing to make in order to further this effort with the government? Hard question. Dr. Dolman, you want to start?
Well, this is the industry side of it, really isn't mine, but they're going to have to, commercial industry is going to have to come up with some understanding of there is some control and regulation that's going to have to be done. If we're going to get the kind of explosion in outer space that we are technically poised for, there's no technicality, there's no technology that we need today to make any of these wonderful programs happen that would provide clean energy in abundance at almost zero cost for all of humanity, that would create industrial capabilities in outer space that do not pollute, that would create capabilities of cleaning up the space environment rather than just trying to limit any more debris, et cetera, that there's going to have to be regulation for that in the sense of an FAA, for example, for space travel, to the extent of regulations for individual companies to follow guidelines on pollution, on access, on equal opportunity, et cetera. In exchange, the government is going to have to give a lot more rein to what companies can do and not be so regulatory and look for ways, in fact, to enhance the capabilities of space. We are going to have some serious concerns, and I mentioned a couple of these, or a couple were mentioned. I mean, what happens when anyone can buy access, whether they're a criminal activity or anyone else, from commercial assets, another country? Why would the United States be the only country that has access to American services? They're going to be available for prices. There may have to be some concessions to the government for allowing them to say there are times, critical national periods, when you're going to have to shut that capability off. And that's going to be difficult, and that will be a compromise. But I think for the most part, American business is willing to do those reasonable requests for that in exchange for lowering regulations, speeding up approvals, and giving authority to do some of these things like launch, which happened very late in the 1990s from commercial sites.
Eric, I'm going to give you the cleanup position on this one. Dean, do you have any thoughts on it?
Only to note that we tend to focus on American business, but space is more and more of a global business. ESA and Ariane are some of the primary competitors for space launch. Small satellites have manufacturers around the world. As India, as South Korea, as other nations join the ranks of spacefaring powers, we also need to be thinking about whatever industrial, whatever private sector structure we orient, that we need to recognize that it can't just be about the United States any more than in the 1970s, automobile decisions were entirely the realm of Detroit. Detroit thought so. We can see what Detroit looks like these days as a result.
Right. Eric, thoughts?
I think a positive aspect from how you rein it in, but also how you let the dogs run wild a little bit. I think that the notion of the public-private partnership, and we've seen great success in this area with what NASA has done on the commercial cargo program and now the commercial crew program. And as Dean highlighted, on the instability of our budget process, last year we had a fight on whether we were going to fully fund the commercial crew program, which I think is just a critical jewel in the United States, space program, that we need to return U.S. astronauts to space on U.S. launch vehicles. And the fact that this was being debated and withholding funds to do this blew my mind. And so, the more stable budget approach, but the public-private partnerships, I think really work. I think it worked with commercial cargo. It's worked well. It's going to work well with crew. And also, I think on the horizon, we're going to see this with space traffic management. The Air Force has got a lot on their plate, and being the world's traffic cop in space was not an additional duty that they signed up for. So to alleviate a little bit of that, maybe handing that off to a civil agency, working with private companies to help out and assist that in areas where they're already doing this work in these operations, I think that's going to be critical. But I think that's the kind of partnership that we need, and that's the kind of balance that continues the innovation that is critical to the development of our industry and our assets, but also working with the government on these best practices.
Excellent. Well, with that, why don't we open up to the floor for questions? Does anybody have any questions out in the audience? We've got one in the back. Rachel. All the way to your left.
Hi, Mike Bruce with Space News. I was wondering if anyone wants to talk about the role of responsive launch vehicles. Obviously, you know, some of those programs are still pretty far from production. XS-1, you know, the Army has looked at a couple programs, Super Stripey launch, but it sounds like those programs are kind of way in the future when we talk about responsive or rapid access to space, that primarily you guys are talking about right now, lowering the cost of launch and relying more on commercial satellite capabilities. And just, I didn't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but wanted to see kind of where you thought these kind of quick turn launch vehicles, what kind of role they'll play in the short term.
Thanks, Mike. Anybody want to pick that one up?
You know, in regards, Mike, that's a great question. And actually, just this morning, I was reading your interview with the head of the Office of ORS, I think from May of last year. I think ORS plays a critical role what they're doing out there, and I think it's unfortunate that every year it's a constant, you know, justification of that office and the things that they're doing. I think as a result of, you know, the success that they've had in ORS 1 and ORS 3. But the rapid launch capability, it's not with us today, and I think we have a lot of companies that we're looking at, whether it be Virgin or Firefly or Rocket Labs or Vulcan or Blue Origin, as they're developing, you know, Blue Origin and SpaceX with their reusable. I certainly see the path forward for the industry, and I would love to see the path forward with the government partnering with the industry and a lot of those aspects of what they're doing on the rapid access to space. I think it's rapidly, not to use rapidly too much, but it's the time's approaching us. I think next year we're going to see a lot of operational launches that are going to take place in 17 and 18. And I just think it's critical that the ORS office, which really is a cradle of ingenuity for the Air Force, that office continues to work closely with industry to help develop and promote what they're trying to do.
Any other thoughts?
Well, I'm not so sure that the reusable spacecraft is as far down the line as we think. We've had reusable spacecrafts, the shuttle obviously being one, and we have the X-37B today and others. These are very expensive and, in fact, too expensive really for most commercial applications today. But SpaceX has now successfully landed 3 times its rocket launcher. It has now launched the GPS satellite. It has now taken supplies to the International Space Station. So I think we're poised at the precipice of actually getting there a lot quicker than we thought on reusable spacecraft. However, reusable spacecraft is only one model for lowering the cost of access to space dramatically. Other companies like Firefly, Blue Origin is also doing reusable, but other companies like that are looking at simply smaller space launch capabilities. Rockets that aren't designed to necessarily take people into space and don't have to worry about G-forces that would squash any biological thing, but maybe you're looking at different types of propellant that would get much smaller rockets faster into space, et cetera. So magnetic guns, all kinds of things can come up when we free the imagination of commerce to look at ideas of low-cost access space and not specifically reusable rockets to space, lower cost. And so I think we're poised now on a strategy system, on a strategy view, as we may have with the United States military. Is it better to try to push technology in a certain direction or be prepared for technology that you think is coming, or is it better just to wait until it comes out and then deal with it? And I think, obviously, anyone would say it's better to try to forecast, see, push, and if new technology comes up that you didn't expect, to try to deal with that as quickly as possible. But reusable space technology and ultra low cost of space is very close to becoming a reality that we need. And as the money comes out of it, and if these very large communications networks, Earth environmental networks of small satellites being launched hundreds at a time on single launch vehicles becomes reality. If the production starts getting up to 100, 200, 300 boosters per year, as is projected by many of these companies in the next few years, 3 to 5 years, we could see a cascading event of this happening rapidly and quickly. And frankly, I hope it does. And we're looking at what would happen if that occurs. What would be the security implications? What would be the commercial implications? How can we take advantage of that from a government side, from a military side, and provide additional advantage to the commercial side, which is where our strength is globally.
Excellent. Dean, any thoughts?
Only that I think the Chinese may already be there. We're just about there on operational responsive space as we think of it. Meaning, you need to put something up, give me 3 weeks, 3 months, not 3 years, not 24 to 36 months, and we'll put it up. And in a world where you have hundreds and hundreds of satellites going up and hundreds of launches, have the grave concern that it may well be the Chinese who steal the march on all of this. Because one, at the end of the day, ULA, SpaceX, et cetera, are companies that are looking at their bottom line. As my friend Derek Scissors, who used to be here at Heritage, pointed out, no one can out-subsidize the Chinese. And so in a world where you are launching hundreds of rockets a year, is it so clear that if the Chinese are offering launch services at literally dollars, maybe even less, per kilogram to orbit, that people won't, especially with small satellites that aren't subject to ITAR, that they won't go to the Chinese, and you wind up watching sort of a lot of radar returns coming out of Chinese launch centers.
Excellent. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Kim Terrell with KIMS. We are a systems engineering and project management company here in DC, woman-owned small SDB. So far aside, I'm curious about this operational responsiveness, rapid redeployment, and how it relates to satellite servicing capabilities on orbit. I'm also curious if you all could speak a little bit more about the commercialization of weather satellites and how they could possibly cooperate or coexist within the government framework, as the Congressman mentioned earlier, with JPSS and GOES.
Dr. Dolan, any thoughts?
On the weather satellites, I'm going to stay off on that. On the reusable satellites and certainly servicing from space, I mean, there are other ways to have rapid reconstitution. One is on-orbit spares, for example, of satellites. And with small satellites, that's a lot cheaper and easier to do. We've been looking at the possibility, and again, just in a research a mode of having on-orbit refueling of satellites to extend lifetime. We use, in the Air Force, we use tankers for aircraft. Could we do something like that, and how would that work in other areas? So we do look at on-orbit servicing. That's a fairly expensive thing right now. We'd have to do it robotically or we have humans doing it, and right now that's a very expensive thing. It's simply cheaper just to put up another satellite. And so unless they're these extraordinarily large satellites, we couldn't simply cheaper put up a new Hubble, for example, or the geostationary belt is an area where those satellites, those large satellites with large capabilities, weather satellites included, that are very valuable, would be on-orbit serviced. In low orbit, it really doesn't make a lot of sense except for manned platforms like the space station. Now, as far as weather goes, however, I think we need to have, I think a lot of the commercial looks for better weather satellites are in networks of low orbit, polar orbiting satellites that could give very good real-time, high-resolution weather capabilities or weather information, not only to the military, of course, which would be tremendously valuable, but certainly in Tornado Alley, here in Washington, where thunderstorms suddenly appear out of nowhere, et cetera. And those are going to be commercial applications that will enhance. So we have to really look at cooperative efforts between existing government systems and commercial systems. And this is an area where if the commercial systems can do it better, the government's still looking at this as basic infrastructure. And I think we have to look at as basic infrastructures. How do we then use relaunch, rapid relaunch, to make sure that we have the capability for commercial access to get this vital information to the public when we need it and when we have an outage. If a massive solar flare could take out just about everything we've got in space. if that happens, do we wait 15 years to reconstitute? That would be devastating. So rapid reconstitution is vital, not just for military purposes, not for somebody being out there, but for meteorological, for the space weather purposes.
Eric, anything to add?
Just what Dr. Dolman said, I think there's it's a business case and a business decision that they have to make on the cost of the servicing of the satellite and the long-term value of the satellite. I know Orbital ATK just announced, I think last month, that they are, creating a business, in-space servicing business for satellites. And so I think there's unique satellites that are out there that, you would want to keep on orbit because of the cost. But I also see it, from the aspect of some of our, the newer companies out there, companies like Planet Labs that are just churning out, new satellites, one a week almost. And it was interesting. When I went out there with a colleague of mine who's here, we went out to visit Planet Labs, and they were describing their version 1 satellite. And it got on a launch vehicle, but it was manifested on a launch vehicle, and then it was delayed, I think, 3 months before it eventually launched. So by the time that version 1 went on the launch, was designated to go on the launch vehicle, by the time it launched, they were already on version 4 of that satellite. And that's how rapid a lot of this technology is happening. So for some of these, more complex, larger satellites, I think there's a business case to be made for it. But I think a lot of the trend is going towards the smaller satellites and these larger constellations that are constantly going to be replenished.
So for the big communication satellites, for example, there's still a market for you still see a viability for the commercial, not commercial, but the satellite servicing side of the house?
I think so.
Well, wonderful. Well, we've got about 9 minutes left, and to keep us on track, I'd like to give each one of these gentlemen an opportunity to provide closing remarks. Before I do that, I'd like to thank each one of you for coming. Eric, Dr. Dolman, Dean, thank you very much for participating. And with that, do you have anything you'd like to close with? Eric?
We touched on a lot today, and there's a lot of issues. As Dean, just open up the box on China. It's of all the things that we're thinking about, right here, right now, that's a whole new world that we had, that we're concerned about, that, there's potential partnerships there. There's so much that is going on in the world of space, and how that's going to lead, and where it's going to lead for us. I'm really upbeat about where the commercial industry is going, and from what I see from my vantage point, we have spaceports. We have a lot of spaceports. Some people say too many spaceports. I don't know what the right number is, but we also have a lot of launch vehicles coming online. And I don't know. I don't have the crystal ball if all of them are going to succeed, but I think that the direction is generally upward for all of them. That there's market with the small satellite, market, the growth of the small satellites and the large constellations that are out there, and also the ingenuity that's going on in space, as we talk about, the satellite servicing, but, mineral resources and mining that's going on right now, and that there's companies that, highly involved in. And so there's so many opportunities out there. And I think there's, I'm not a doctor in economics, but I can see that as you reduce the cost of access to space, you're going to increase the innovation and the technology that's happening, that's going to go on, and it's really exciting. And I think that the next big thing is something we haven't even thought about. But as we reduce the access to costs, and reusability is critical, and what SpaceX and Blue Origin are getting a lot of the limelight right now. But a lot of folks, a lot of other small companies are working on this technology. When you reduce that access to space, there's no telling of the new technology that we're going to have, and we're going to be dealing with 5 years down the line. So I think it's an exciting time for the industry. As we talk about the involvement of the government, I do use the word partnership very broadly. I think industry, it's like an open house. You want to show them what you have, and more often than not, they're awed with what technology you have, and it's just integrating that technology that's out there for their utilization, and just to speed up that process. I really think that's critical, because you're right, that rapid access to space doesn't mean manifesting a launch 3 years out. I think the goal should be 3 months and eventually 3 weeks. That's rapid access to space, and I think it's down the horizon, but we're not there yet. But I know that there's a lot of companies that are working on it. There's a lot of smart people working on it, and as long as the investment community sees that there's a future in this, I think it's the sky's the limit. Pardon the pun.
Outstanding. Dr. Dolman.
Well, Eric, I agree, and I share your optimism. I think we're standing at the precipice of a golden age in space, potentially. Things have happened before. I thought we'd get there.
Sure.
Back in when I saw Stanley Kubrick's fantastic movie, 2001: Space Odyssey, I was hoping we'd be on our way to Jupiter by now. But things happen. The real world intervenes, and politics is a fascinating and interesting area because the decisions that we make there really are traumatic. In class at Air University, we teach that if you can make a decision between good and bad, choose good. We're clear on that. And better and worse, we're still on the side of better. But we don't get those chances. We don't get those questions and decisions. What we get is you can do this in which people will be hurt, or you can do that in which people will be hurt, and let's hope the best one is an outcome, and you have to make that. We're looking at the idea that you cannot get some good without bad. And one of the primary questions we have to look at a military university where I teach is, from our perspective, how much of our national security should we outsource to private business and commerce? It depends greatly on where you exist in the world and how long you've been going in a time of peace and where your strengths lie. Adam Smith, the founder of modern free market economics, said there are 4 areas where the government can intervene, and the most important of those is that national security does not belong to the vagaries of the market. However, you can access the market, partner with it in such ways that both commercial development and national security can be helped, and I think we're there. Reducing the cost of access to space is the key. If we can get cost of access in space reduced by a factor of, my factors are always wrong, but say 10 here in this case, a remarkable reduction in access. What would happen if you moved from the average launch cost, European Space Agency right now about $180 million for their launches, to about $5 million for launch? What would happen then? What kind of things would business, would innovators, would garage mechanics come up with that'll change the way we live? Look how quickly cell phone activity has just changed the way we think about the world and our relationships with each other. I'm very excited about what could happen, and I think we can either stall this activity or we can sort of nudge it along in the right direction, and I hope the latter is what we do.
Thank you, sir. Dean?
You really shouldn't let me conclude remarks on panels because I'm inevitably the Eeyore of the bunch. I would say the following. As we stand on the precipice of this wonderful, bright new era of commercial space, one, I think we've been here before and sort of watch as things don't go off the launch pads and budgets get reallocated and the rest. So I'm going to simply say the following, that as we proceed down space development, if we do, and even if we don't, that the commercial sector in particular needs to think about information security. And information security here means several things. It means security of your satellite design, so that all the R&D money you pour in isn't then sort of lopped off by somebody else. Of satellite operations, tracking, telemetry, and control. Be nice if it was encrypted, be nice if it was secure. Of the data that passes over all of these satellites, which is different, of course, from the TT&C. And finally, of your own business operations. If you think you are going to be bidding on a particular contract, recognize that there are a lot of other people out there, not all of them Americans, who are probably going to be wanting to know exactly what that bid is going to be and what your bottom line is going to be, and that if you're still using password as your password, they're probably going to be quite familiar with your bidding and bid and proposal procedures. So, but as I said, I'm the Eeyore of the bunch.
Well, on that happy note, I'd like to thank each one of you. Ladies and gentlemen, would you join me in giving them a round of applause? Thank you very much for attending.